Welcome to this in-depth exploration of one of the most chilling serial killers in American history, Juan Vallejo Corona. Known as the Machete Murderer, Corona was convicted of one of the deadliest killing sprees in the early 1970s, shocking the nation with his brutal and seemingly senseless murders of 25 migrant farm workers in California. Over the next hour, we'll uncover his early life, the disturbing pattern of his crimes, the painstaking investigation, and the trial that ultimately brought him to justice. Juan Corona was born on February 7, 1934, in the rural town of Otlán, Jalisco, Mexico. He was one of many children in a large family, and from a young age, he experienced the hardships of poverty in rural Mexico. Life in Otlán was not easy. Limited resources, poor health care, and lack of education marked the childhood of many in his community, including Corona himself. At the age of 16, Juan Corona moved to the United States, like many other Mexicans seeking better job opportunities. He settled in California's agricultural regions, where migrant workers were in high demand to support the booming farming industry. Corona found work as a labor contractor, organizing crews of farm workers to harvest fruits and vegetables. Despite being an outsider in American society, he managed to build a decent living for himself, providing for his family and becoming somewhat of a respected figure in the migrant worker community. But beneath this surface of respectability, a much darker and more violent personality would soon emerge. Corona's struggles with mental health began in 1955. At 21 years old, he suffered a severe mental breakdown that landed him in DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, a mental illness characterized by episodes of psychosis, hallucinations, and delusions. At the time, his mental health was treated with electric shock therapy, which was a common treatment for severe mental disorders during that era. After a few months of treatment, Corona was discharged from the hospital. Though he appeared to recover on the surface, the dark side of his psyche lingered beneath. In the years that followed, his mental health would deteriorate again, exacerbating his violent tendencies. By the late 1960s, Corona was a well-known labor contractor in the Yuba City area of Northern California. He worked with many of the migrant farm workers who traveled through the region seasonally, finding them jobs and taking a portion of their earnings in return. While he was trusted by his employers and many workers, something changed in 1971. That year, Corona began to systematically murder men, mostly migrant workers who were transient and had no one looking for them. Corona's modus operandi was particularly brutal. He would lure his victims, most of whom were solitary, vulnerable men working in the fields, into remote locations. Once they were alone, he would viciously attack them with a machete or knife, overpowering and killing them with swift, brutal force. Some victims were shot, while others were hacked to death. Afterward, Corona would bury their bodies in shallow graves in orchards or along the Feather River. His first known murder occurred in March 1971, when the body of a migrant worker named Jose Romero was found in an orchard near Marysville. At the time, the connection between Romero's death and Corona had not been established, but it was the beginning of a deadly spree that would claim the lives of 25 men in just a few months. In May 1971, the horrors of Juan Corona's actions began to come to light. It all started with the discovery of a shallow grave in a peach orchard in Sutter County, California. The body found in the grave was identified as that of Kenneth Whitaker, another migrant worker. Investigators initially believed it to be an isolated incident, but they were about to uncover a far more chilling reality. As authorities continued their search in the orchards, more graves were discovered, each containing the bodies of men who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The gruesome finds shocked the community and sent ripples of fear through the migrant worker population. Who was killing these men and why? For the next few weeks, more and more bodies were unearthed, each revealing the brutal handiwork of a remorseless killer. The bodies were found with multiple stab wounds, some with slashes across their heads and necks, and many had been buried with their hands tied. It was clear that these were not random killings but part of a calculated and systematic murder spree. Chapter 5: The arrest of Juan Corona. As the investigation intensified, suspicion quickly turned to Juan Corona. Corona had been the labor contractor responsible for hiring most of the victims, and several witnesses recalled seeing him with men who had later gone missing. Additionally, when authorities searched Corona's home, they found incriminating evidence, including a machete, knives, blood-stained clothing, and a ledger containing the names of the victims. Corona's trial was one of the most sensational in California's history at the time. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence linking him to the murders, including the testimony of witnesses who saw him with some of the victims before their deaths. The physical evidence, blood-stained weapons, clothing, and the ledger cemented the case against him. The defense tried to argue that Corona was mentally ill and, therefore, not responsible for his actions. They cited his history of schizophrenia and his previous mental breakdowns as evidence that he was not in control of his faculties at the time of the murders. However, the prosecution countered by arguing that Corona had clearly been methodical in his killings and had shown no signs of delusion or hallucination during his interactions with the victims. In 1973, Juan Corona was convicted of all 25 murders and sentenced to 25 consecutive life sentences. His conviction was based on the evidence of premeditation and the sheer number of victims. Despite his defense team's efforts to secure a reduced sentence based on mental illness, the court found him fully responsible for his actions. Juan Corona spent the rest of his life behind bars, serving his sentence at California's Corcoran State Prison. His time in prison was marked by multiple appeals and attempts to overturn his conviction, all of which were unsuccessful. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Corona maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. While incarcerated, Corona's mental health continued to deteriorate. He experienced periods of delusion and paranoia, and, at times, he withdrew entirely from interactions with other inmates and prison staff. His violent past and the grisly nature of his crimes made him one of the most infamous inmates in the California penal system. The case of Juan Corona left a lasting impact on California and the criminal justice system. His brutal murder spree highlighted the vulnerability of migrant workers, many of whom were undocumented and had no family or friends to report them missing. The case also raised questions about the treatment of mental illness in the criminal justice system and whether individuals like Corona could be held fully accountable for their actions. In the decades since Corona's conviction, he has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and articles exploring his crimes and their impact on California's migrant worker community. His case remains one of the deadliest and most shocking serial killer cases in American history. Juan Corona's story is a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a seemingly ordinary facade. His crimes were brutal, senseless, and devastating to the families of his victims. Today, we remember the 25 men whose lives were taken in such a horrific manner, and hope that by studying cases like this, we can better understand the minds of those who commit such heinous acts. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and crimes of Juan Corona. Please like, subscribe, and share this video if you found it informative. And let us know in the comments what you think about this case, what drives a man to commit such horrific crimes. We'd love to hear your thoughts.